Okay, I think we should get started, and it's possible that others are going to join us, but also that they are going to wait to listen in on the recording. So thank you for being here, and since we're such a small group, I would really like to just hear your voices and hear your names. So could you just unmute and tell me who you are, and maybe a little bit about yourself and your interest in the program?
Sure, I'll go first. My name's Morgan Harris. I'm calling in from Cambridge from my office. I work at Harvard University. I do government relations and public affairs for the university here. But I live in Beverly, and I grew up on the North Shore. And my husband and I recently moved back and have sort of put down roots on the North Shore permanently. And I think board service has always been something that I've seen on the horizon, and being involved with organizations in a less formal way, more in sort of greater Boston downtown. I'm really looking to get involved in organizations that are closely connected and serving my more immediate community in Essex County. So this is great. Thank you.
Fantastic. How good to meet you. And there's Brenda, and she's even on video. Hi.
Yeah.
Brenda, I think your microphone is muted, or at least the other one is muted if you're called in by phone.
I just lost. Let me see.
Sometimes I find if you have the computer and the phone on that you have to either hang up the phone or use the phone but turn the volume on your computer all the way off so you don't get that echo.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Is that better?
Yes, it is better. Yeah.
All right. I had to switch to a laptop because my desktop was not working.
So I just asked, I don't know if you got to hear Morgan introduce herself. We have many more people who are coming next Friday, but I guess are planning to listen to the recording of this presentation. So thanks for being here in person. Could you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your interest in the program?
Yeah, my name is Brenda Soucy. I am a tax preparer and manager at a firm in the Merrimack Valley. And I am just looking for organizations in the area that I could help, advise, learn more about. I grew up in Merrimack Valley and, have been around and see a lot going on here. So I just want to be able to help and do whatever I can for these organizations.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, so why don't we start the presentation, and you can stop me at any time. We're a very small group, so just speak up. I'll try to leave some space every once in a while for there to be a room for questions. Let me tell you what we're planning to do today. Right now, we have two webinars, and you may find them both to be of interest. The one today is really focused on board basics, and I'm sure that you both have a lot of skills and probably some basic knowledge about board work. So I hope that this is not too basic for you, but what we're going to do today is go through the essentials of what board service entails, what your basic responsibilities are, and in particular, I want to give you some ideas of questions that you can ask when you have the opportunity to meet with the nonprofit organizations next week, so that you can really get a better feel, not just for the organization and what its mission is and what it does, but what would it mean to serve on the board. So that's what we're going to do today. And like I said, we'll stop and hear your questions. And hopefully I can tell you a little bit about how next Friday is also going to work. So hopefully that sounds good. Yeah, great. Okay. So the premise here is that all of us are positioned to be fantastic board members. It's really not about the specifics of what you know or the fact that you know people with money and influence, but it's about your passion and your commitment that's going to make you a valued contributor to the board. That doesn't mean that your skills don't matter. Your skills do matter very, very much, but it's how you show up, how you bring them. A lot of what happens in a boardroom can be taught. Certainly the specifics of any organization will be something that you can learn. So there's not a lot of prerequisites from the point of view of skills. And what's really important is that you understand what the requirements are and then you fulfill them. So there are really just 3 broad categories of obligations for board members. And just as background here, all nonprofits, as you probably know, are required by law to have a board of directors. And the board is how the organization stays accountable to the community. And since the organization has a tax-free status at both the state and federal levels, the Attorney General is the source of guidelines around what nonprofits are required to do and how they are supposed to be fulfilling their mission in order to retain that charitable status. So the board members are in place to provide another layer of security around ensuring that nonprofit organizations are living up to their charitable purpose. And the board members, from that point of view, have 3 obligations. So the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and then BoardSource, which is a national resource for boards of nonprofits across the country and a wonderful source of tools and training and research into boards and how they function, has also suggested that there's a 3rd duty, which is the duty of obedience. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what those are. So what is the duty of care? The duty of care means that if you have signed up to become a board member, you are obligated to use your best judgment, to actively participate, to make decisions based on information, to take those decisions carefully and seriously, right? And if you think about what I just said about why the Attorney General has created these duties of care, basically they're relying on you as board members to not be a rubber stamp, but to be involved, to be paying attention, and to be making sure that as you make decisions, which the board will be voting on a variety of decisions that could be things like approving the annual budget, it could be hiring and firing the executive director, it could be making decisions about programs, how to make certain kinds of investments in the community. So the requirement as a board member is that you obtain the information that you need prior to making decisions, and that you're using your best judgment and exercising autonomy and independence. That's part of the duty of care. What is the duty of loyalty? That means that you're going to put aside your own personal interests and your professional interests and put the organization's interests first and the community's interests. So, of course, we always hope that there is not a conflict between the interests of the community and the interests of the organization. But you as board members will be looking at that and trying to ensure that the community's interests are first. And this whole concept of conflict of interest is also very important. So for example, a good board and a good organization will require you on an annual basis to declare any conflicts of interest that you might have. So let's say, for example, I think Brenda mentioned that you're a tax attorney, a tax preparer.
Yeah.
So if you were offering your services free of charge to the organization to provide tax services, or even if you were, certainly if you were getting paid for those services, but even if you were offering them free of charge, that could be either a real or a perceived conflict of interest of your ability to exercise independent judgment. So the organization is trying to make sure that the board members don't have personal and professional interests and motivations tied up with their engagement as board members. So this does not mean I think Morgan mentioned, you know, we live in the community and we care about the community. We want to be involved locally. So that's a personal interest. But that's not the kind of personal interest that's being referred to here. It's really talking about sort of financial gain. And the request is that all personal and professional advancement would be put aside, and that the organization and the community's interests would come first.
Okay.
The third is the duty of obedience. So what this means is that as a board, as a board member, you are obliged to stay true to the organization's mission and make sure that the organization is obeying the law. Now, these are also the responsibilities of the executive director, right? And the executive director is the one most likely who is paying attention to things like, do we have the right HR policies in place? Are we withholding taxes appropriately, and so forth? But you as board members are ultimately responsible. And so it's important that at some point in your tenure, there's a review of sort of the basics, and that there is a clarity about the fact that the organization is obeying all laws and policies. And your role as board members is certainly to make sure that the organization stays true to its mission. So let me pause there for just a second and see if you have any questions about those. They're very, very broad, obviously, not a lot of detail.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay. Okay, so that sounds great, right? But what does it really mean in practice? What do board members actually do? How do they spend their time? So traditionally, boards have three broad responsibilities. So this is now getting into not what is your obligation, but what is the actual practice? What do you do as a board member? First, big bucket of things you do is to set the organizational direction. The second is to ensure that the required resources are in place. And by that, I mean not only the financial resources, but physical resources, physical assets of all kinds, and also human resources, especially leadership. And then the third is to provide oversight and ensure that money is being spent properly and the organization is fulfilling its mission. So under the heading of setting organizational direction comes all of the really big picture thinking, determining the mission and purpose, establishing the strategic direction, ensuring that there is planning that is aligned with the strategic direction and that the planning leads to implementation, and that there is a set of organizational values that are regularly referenced and that the organization stays true to those values. So as a prospective board member, one of the things you might think about is learning about how each of the boards that you speak with actually sets their strategic direction. Because, let me just go back here for one moment. Although these basics are true for every board, the specifics of how they happen are going to be quite variable. And in many, many cases, and in fact, it makes a lot of sense that the executive director should play a very pivotal role. On the other hand, if the executive director is the one who is exclusively responsible for, let's say, creating the strategic plan or doing an annual plan, or if the board members tell you, well, we just rely on the executive director to make sure that we're true to mission, then part of your takeaway would be, okay, the board is not playing a very active role around this responsibility of setting organizational direction. So my suggestion is that you ask some pointed questions to learn how each board that you speak with is involved in setting strategic direction. So for example, are they taking a look at their mission, revisiting it periodically? Do they have a strategic plan? What is it? Where is it? Can you read it? When is it going to be up for renewal? One of the reasons for asking about that would be typically the board is quite involved in driving the strategic plan, and it would be very interesting for you to know, let's say you're interested in joining a board by the fall of 2020, and you learn that the strategic plan is going to expire at the end of 2020 and the organization is embarking on a new strategic plan process. That may be something that really excites you, or maybe something that you say, wow, I don't know if I want to get involved in that right at this moment, right? So just learning a little bit about how the organization does that type of work and where they are in their cycles can be very, very helpful. The second responsibility that I was in that first list is about ensuring resources, physical, financial, human. And a huge piece here is selecting and evaluating the chief executive. Building a competent board. The board itself is responsible for its own membership and its own competence. So although again, staff are involved, frequently the ED and maybe the person in charge of volunteers, maybe the person in charge of donor relations, have a number of contacts in the community and have people that they'd like to suggest for board membership, but the board is ultimately responsible for making the decision about who sits around the table and for ensuring that people are doing their jobs. And the board is responsible to make sure that the organization remains in good public standing out in the world. So as you meet with prospective boards, you could ask some questions about how this particular board actually is involved in securing resources. So for example, how do they get their funding? What are the different types of sources that they have? Is it all from foundations? Is it from any kind of social enterprise? Is there some kind of membership process in place? Do people pay for services of any kind, or services reimbursed, and so forth, right? What is board members' role around fundraising? Good boards have specific roles for board members to play. That does not mean that board members, out of their own personal resources, are responsible for financing the organization. But what it does mean is that board members are engaged in the plan for raising finances for the organization under the direction, typically, of an individual who could be the executive director or who works closely with the executive director to design the fundraising strategy. It could mean that there is a role in meeting with donors in the community. It could mean that there's a role for board members to play around particular events that happen through the year that help raise money. So asking what each organization's expectations are for board roles in fundraising is very important, as well as what their policy is and their expectation is for board giving. Most private foundations that fund nonprofits want to see 100% giving from board members. And the reason that that is a typical expectation is because if you're a board member and you don't care enough about the future of the organization to want to provide some sort of financial support to that organization, it actually is considered to be a reflection of the organization not building a strong enough community base. So boards typically, organizations typically will have some sort of policy and expectation of board giving. You would probably want to find out if it is a particular monetary amount or if the policy is based more on an expectation of you making this organization a priority for your personal giving at whatever level makes sense for your income and situation in your life. So having a frank conversation about that prior to joining a board is really very important. And then, as I mentioned, the board is responsible for the hiring and the evaluation, of the executive director. So it's very, very important to probe and to ask, what is the relationship with the executive director? How long has this executive director been in place? Are there any inklings that there will be a leadership change in the next 1 to 3 years? Do we have a leadership succession plan in place? You as board members would be very, very involved in moving forward to help select, identify, and then ultimately select and hire a new executive director should there be a leadership change coming down the pike. So as you start to talk with prospective boards that are of interest to you, learning about how they relate to the executive director and how often they review the executive director, and when that executive director may or may not step down would also be very important things to find out about. I'm going to pause here for just one moment because that was a lot, and then we'll go on to the third responsibility. Do we have any questions so far on anything I've shared?
I don't believe I do.
Just in terms of next Friday, are most of the representatives of the organization's board members, or are they leadership within a nonprofit organization that may be an executive director or some other part of the administration of a nonprofit?
Yeah, good question. So our hope and our suggestion is that both the executive director and a board member, ideally the board chair, come to the event. So I don't know for sure if we have finalized everybody in terms of who's representing each organization, but that's our hope. So I think if you have the opportunity to meet only one person, it should be a board member, but I think it would be extremely helpful to have a staff person there as well, ideally the executive director. So fingers crossed that's how.
Yeah, that's helpful to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so responsibility 3, providing oversight. So this is probably the area that most people associate with boards and think primarily about the role in providing financial oversight, in particular, making sure that funds are being expended with integrity. But this also is a function for, as I mentioned, supporting and evaluating the chief executive, and also just in general monitoring and supporting the implementation of programs and services. So it relates back to the focus on mission, and it also relates to things like decisions that might have to be made around budget. So knowing what's happening at the level of programs is quite important when it comes to making a decision about the annual budget. Should we be investing more in a particular area? Are the expenses running ahead of what the impact is? Do we have to really rethink what the programs are? So all of these questions are typically handled at the level of committees and then brought forward into conversation with the full board at regular meetings. So as mentioned multiple times, the executive director answers to the board. The board is responsible for the hiring, the firing, the evaluation, and that creates complexities in the relationship, right? Because the executive director is also responsible for bringing the board information, decisions, engaging with the board around the future of the organization, engaging with the board around planning, around setting direction. So this is really the heart of the most important relationship that drives forward nonprofit organizations, the relationship between the executive director and the board. And ideally, we're looking for a relationship that's based on mutual respect, where there is transparency, there's clear expectations, that there's really strong and good communication and a model of constructive partnership. I hope and I believe that the organizations that you're going to meet next week already have very strong and positive relationships in place with the executive director. And it is certainly a piece of what would make your experience as a board member much more positive, to the degree that the executive director and the board function and work well together. So this is really at the heart of what makes a good board function well. So questions that you might ask around oversight would be something that came up earlier. Is there a conflict of interest policy? You know, and at some point you might ask to see that if you're getting close to making a decision on a board. What kind of training is provided so that all board members are able to read and understand financials? Not everyone has to serve on a finance committee, for example, right? Some people that are really good with numbers or very familiar with profit and loss statements have a lot of experience dealing with finances, might be the ones who choose to work on a finance committee. But their recommendations and suggestions and summaries will be brought to the full committee, and the full board will be required to approve financial statements. So everyone needs to be able to understand the basics and have enough information to be able to make a decision and a vote with full confidence that they understand the implications. And it's the board's responsibility, working with staff, of course, to provide training to you as incoming board members so that you are positioned to fulfill your responsibilities. You might want to ask what the annual budget process is, how much are board members involved in that, and you would want to know what the annual evaluation of the ED looks like. And if you find out that there is not an annual process, you would want to know whether the board has ever evaluated the ED. As I mentioned, even though these responsibilities are universal, every board's experience and execution against those responsibilities is individual. And depending on where the organization is in its overall stage of growth, you may find that it's a relatively young organization, maybe it's still being led by its founder, and there has never been a board evaluation of the ED. And if that's the case, that can be seen as a great opportunity, because you as a new board member can be involved in helping that board continue to mature and take on even more pick up more of its roles and responsibilities. So I'm going to keep going, but please jump in if you have questions or would like me to pause. Just somehow get my attention and I'll be happy to stop for a second. So what are your personal responsibilities? Your personal responsibilities are really quite simple from the point of view of how you show up, right? So it's about active participation, not just attending meetings, but being engaged, being informed, being prepared, providing your, I have here time, talent, and treasure, right? So you bring your skills to the table, you bring your time, you bring your treasure from the point of view of both the financial contribution, but also being willing to speak about the organization to your neighbors, your friends, your family, your community members, your church members, and so forth. Act as an ambassador out in the community for this organization to help to continue to build goodwill, awareness, and strengthen the organization's standing in the community. Most boards require members to serve on committees because that's where most of the actual work that boards do gets done. Typical committees would be the finance committee, the governance committee, but depending on the organization, they may have committees established around fundraising, around donor relationships, around events, around different programs and services that are provided. And so learning about what those committees are and what the expectations are for your service is an important part of considering whether or not you would pursue membership in a particular board. I've already talked a little bit about your responsibility to promote the organization, which also might include recruiting other board members and other volunteers. Certainly asking good questions, and I have to say this is not all on you as new members. It's important that the board create an inclusive environment and a welcoming environment where your questions are welcome and where you feel encouraged to speak up and be able to ask the questions that come up for you. As new members, you may have a lot of questions. And it's important that the environment be one that welcomes your questions and encourages your participation. Certainly you have a responsibility, as mentioned earlier, to safeguard legal standards, to make sure that you are fulfilling all legal obligations, that you don't ask any special favors from staff, and that you follow conflict of interest, confidentiality, harassment, and any other important procedures and policies. So you need to be able to ask of potential boards, have they created a job description or at least an explanation of what their expectations are of new board members? What kind of orientation is provided and who is responsible for providing it? Are you going to be talking only with staff? Are you going to be speaking with staff and board and so forth? What is the committee structure? And how many committees would I be expected to serve on? If you can, and if you have some time to deliberate over your choices of organizations, it would be helpful to ask to see some recent meeting agendas and minutes of board meetings. Why do I say that? Because the heart of this whole thing, in addition to the ED board relationship, is all about what happens around that board table. So I'm going to make an assumption for a moment that you join a board because you care about the organization, you care about what it does in the community, you want to see it succeed, you want to give back by sharing your skills, your time, your financial support with that organization. If you get into a board role and instead of being engaged, you feel that the meetings don't have purpose, that you're either bored, confused, you don't feel that your questions are welcomed, you don't feel that as a board member that board roles are appreciated, perhaps you feel overwhelmed by the amount of material that's provided and not enough time to discuss it, or you sense that there's an atmosphere of mistrust. All of those types of circumstances actually lead to sort of the drying up of your engagement and commitment, and not just yours, of course, but other board members as well. So what we're looking for, of course, is the exact opposite of that. We're looking for a sense in a typical board meeting that people are engaged, that there's great discussion, that important and meaningful conversations are taking place. So you want to ask, what happens at a typical board meeting? When you're looking at agendas and minutes, you want to look at what's being discussed. And do you have a feeling that the discussion matters? Is it important? How much time, as you sit around the table, is devoted to reporting out, wherein either staff members or committee chairs are basically sharing reports and very little is discussed by the board? Or is there an opportunity for board members to really engage around the content? In other words, who's doing most of the speaking? And I have a question here that you might want to explore, which is whether the board uses a consent agenda. This is a tool that is extremely valuable. Not all boards use it, but the idea of the consent agenda is that things like our minutes from last meeting, basic report outs that don't need discussion or decisions by the board would be bundled into a package that is presented to board members ahead of the meeting. And there's a simple vote at the beginning of the meeting, just an up or down, to accept the contents of the consent agenda. And why this matters is because if a board meeting is, let's say, only an hour and a half, maximum 2 hours, and a lot of time is given over to the routine reading of minutes, reports, and so forth with no discussion, it actually eats up time on the agenda that could be used more productively for conversation about mission, about organizational direction, wrestling with an upcoming choice that the ED might have to make, getting involved, thinking creatively about future opportunities and so forth. So the more that kind of routine matters can be handled outside the time of the limited amount of time all of you are together at a board meeting, the more it's going to contribute to a sense of engagement and a sense of my time at this meeting is valued and really matters. It's also helpful to ask, how have you built community within your board? How does your board operate as a team? Why do I say that? Because boards where people don't know one another and where there really isn't any engagement of board members other than I walk into a room, I sit down at a table, we spend 2 hours listening to reports, and then we walk out. In that type of a setting, it's very, very difficult for board members to actually fulfill their responsibilities. People don't develop a sense of trust with one another, and people don't know one another well enough to be able to ask important questions. You want to make sure that the important discussion happens in the meeting and not in a parking lot or somehow outside of the meeting, because I feel close to one person and I run into him or her in the parking lot and he or she and I start talking about something that we didn't feel comfortable raising with our other colleagues around the table. That kind of setting, which can happen, of course, is counterproductive to really delivering on the promise of what a board can actually do for the organization. So taking time to build community, just in some of these simple ways of having food at the meetings, having named cards, having people that help you with technology. If there's a remote option, for example, to call in, is there somebody that's helping you with that? Is there a board mentor program? Have they done something like provide you with a guide to the most common acronyms so that you are able to follow when people start using those acronyms in a meeting? Is there a strong board orientation? Do board members see one another at all outside of the boardroom? For example, do they volunteer together at the organization? Are there board retreats? All of these are ways that people build connections with one another around that table. And as a result, that helps with when things get difficult, as they may, right? If there's a challenge around funding, if there's a challenge around staffing, if there's concerns about the leadership, if there's concerns about something that's shifted in the community and the organization needs to respond. Those person-to-person relationships need to be in place around the board table so that the board is better equipped to be able to tackle the challenging times as well as the good times. So again, let me pause there and see what kind of questions you might have with anything that's been raised so far.
I guess I have sort of one question, and maybe it's been answered, but in terms of making those decisions, is that generally the chair, or just in terms of how the board governs itself traditionally, or is that something that is collaborative? Is it something that is done through an executive director as well? I mean, I'm sure there's a million different formulas, but I'm just curious what you find is most common.
Well, actually, it's highly variable, Morgan, and some organizations put what they call an executive committee in place with their board, and that might be the board officers. And depending on the organization, the executive committee can function almost as a board within the board.
Yeah, okay.
My experience around that is that it actually can be very counterproductive, because if people come to the table with a sense that somebody else has already grappled with this and has already made a decision and they're just expecting me to sign off on it, it puts you as the other board member in a very challenging position. Knowing that someone's expecting you to sign off and yet feeling like, well, wait a second, I'm not sure I have all the information, right? So these are the kind of things that you may not be able to ascertain 100% before you join a board, but the more that you can be, I guess, alert and aware of different types of practices, and not come with any prejudgments, but just look to see how are decisions made in this particular board, and to the degree that you don't understand, why things would have been decided a certain way, feel free that you can probe that and you can ask questions. Decisions really should not be made exclusively by the chair and the executive director working together. Most decisions, big decisions, will have to be signed off on by the full board, regardless of where the recommendation came from. So typically the way that happens is that a motion would be presented to the full board for a decision. The motion could be recommended by staff. It could be recommended by committees. It could be recommended by the chair. But there's typically a motion is presented and someone seconds it, meaning it's now on the table for discussion. In a setting where the board is very engaged, that opens the floor for there to be good conversation about the decision. In another type of setting where a lot of pre-work has gone on and board members feel caught up to speed because they've learned about this through committee reports, or they've been following the issue for several months. That could be another time where you see that there's not a lot of discussion. By the time something comes forward as a motion, there's not a lot of discussion, but there was discussion of it earlier before we presented, right? But if something comes to the table and is basically already a fait accompli, and the rest of the board members are really just being asked to sign off on it without an opportunity for real engagement, that to me would be sort of a red flag around a lack of real engagement by the full board.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
What is the average board size?
Right, great question, because there really is not an answer. Most boards, I would say, are in the range of 9+. They could be double that. They could be like 15, 17. It could be smaller. I work with a board right now that's only 7 members, but they have a very robust committee structure. So it really depends on how the board is organized. One of the things that I did not go over would be sort of the standard committees. If there's a lot of committees and there's an expectation that members serve, of course, on committees, then there may tend to be a lot of members. There could also be a smaller standing board and committees that are populated by 1 or 2 members per committee, with the other people being advisors or committee members who are not board members. So it really depends on how the board is organized. It's helpful to have an odd number, because for the purposes of decision making, it's helpful to have an odd number. And the number would typically be set in the bylaws. The bylaws are the legal document that was created when the organization was established. They can be changed and updated by the board. So even bylaws are not set in concrete and can be adjusted. But most boards would have, I would say it's more common to have a range rather than an actual absolute number. it typically gets set it's just sort of like as a norm. So if a board has been around for a long time, or the organization has been functioning for a long time, chances are they've settled into a practice of having within that range that's authorized to them, that they've settled on a number. So let's say it's 13 members, and you want to find out, of course, what the terms are, if it's a 2-year commitment, a 3-year commitment, if it's something that gets renewed, how many times can you renew, or are there no term limits at all, right? You might like to find out how long what's the average tenure of a board member? If you find out that most of the members have been around the table for the whole time the organization's been in existence, that will tell you something, versus an organization that brings on new people every 3 years, say. We always introduce new board members at the end of every term. So learning about their culture, how they handle it, but unfortunately there really isn't sort of an average out there. So much of it will depend on really the scale of the organization itself, its geographic spread, the size of the staff, if it's a very tiny organization with only a very small number of staff, it may have a relatively small board as well, and vice versa.
Okay, thank you.
I have another quick question,
Sure.
if you don't mind. How often do you find that boards, or that organizations have a makeup of their board in mind, in terms of, they're like, we need the board to represent legal, tax issues, fundraising experience, marketing experience, or some sort of specialty that they're going in and looking to recruit board members that fulfill a certain expertise, versus those that may not? And are there benefits or challenges to either of those?
Yep. Yeah, good question. And I would even add that some organizations are legally bound to have certain types of representation on their boards. So if you have a certain legal status as a community housing organization, for example, you might be required to have certain types of housing tenants on your board, or that kind of thing. So I would say that the norm, or what's most common, is that boards actually do approach board membership with that type of mentality. And my personal mission is to try to talk boards out of seeking board members based on skill sets. Why do I say that? A lot of the relationships that you mentioned can be cultivated in different ways. So is it required to have an attorney on your board? Not necessarily. Is it required that an organization have an attorney that is willing to provide pro bono advice, that is basically a friend of the organization? Yes, that's very, very important. And most boards, I would say most boards do tend to have somebody on their board with legal background. Most boards would like to have an attorney, I think, if they could. But honestly, is it a requirement? No, it is not. Do you need people who understand how to read financials? Yes, you do. Do you need people who can engage skillfully with the CFO and with the ED and basically be able to provide financial advice? Yes, you do. And it's helpful for that person for a person like that to be the treasurer of the organization. But does every single person on your board need to have the same level of financial expertise? No, they do not. And the board itself can provide some of that training, as I mentioned earlier, around reading basic financials. So I believe very, very strongly that community members of all types of backgrounds can be very effective board members. And furthermore, that it's counterproductive to the goal of diversifying leadership in every possible way, to be thinking, to be starting from a point of view of we need X skill set, instead of looking at we need to build a board that's broadly representative of our community. So unfortunately, the statistics show that most boards are still overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly in an older demographic. And boards, just like organization staff, are moving in the direction of attempting to diversify themselves. But if we don't start from the premise of creating a welcoming and inclusive environment that's open to all, and that, you know, taps people for their all the whole range of skills and contributions that they bring to the table, we're limiting ourselves and making it more difficult to actually diversify, whether it's by age, by gender, by race, by language, and so forth.
Certainly. Thank you.
Yeah, you may find that, I mean, boards will be clearly, of course, and as they should be, very interested in your skill set. And that's a big piece of what you bring. So there's no shyness. There shouldn't be any shyness on your part about sharing your actual skills.
Right.
The point I'm trying to make is that we need to think broadly about what those skill sets are and all of the different things that you bring, based on your experience, based on your lived experience, your professional experience, the networks that you're part of, and so forth. So it's not strictly your job description that defines whether or not you'll be a good board member. So moving on, my last couple of slides here are really for you to just contemplate as you're going into these conversations. As you understand more about what the legal responsibilities are, what the expectations are, just being sure that you are willing to fulfill those responsibilities, that you're willing to share your time, your skills, your financial support, serve as an ambassador for the organization, and make it a priority for your charitable giving. Remember that being a board member is different from being a volunteer, and you will sort of be on the inside, learning about how a nonprofit functions, by learning about how they set their budgets, how they operate their programs, how they deal with human resources, how they deal with donors, and so forth. So if that excites you and interests you, then it's a wonderful place to be. If you're really only connected to, I want to be able to be out there serving involvement in the programs, then you might find that what's discussed at the board table doesn't meet all of your needs. So it's really about making sure that your expectations and what board service will be like are aligned. But to reiterate, right, it's not exclusively about what you know or who you know, but it's about who you are as a person, the full breadth of what you bring to the table and how you care. That's going to make you a valued and contributing member of any board, and boards will be happy, to have you as their members. You can read more about learning about what are the basics of board responsibilities at some of these sources. So for example, the Attorney General's office. GuideStar is a database out there that can introduce you to nonprofits in our region. Of course, next Friday will be an opportunity for you to meet a number of organizations in Essex County, but there may not be the precise fit for you for any number of reasons, whether it's around the issue, the location, the timing, any number of things. So learning more about who's out there and understanding more about how they operate could also be a part of you discovering an organization that you'd like to approach about becoming a board member. And then, as I mentioned, Board Source, which is a place that you can learn more about board roles and responsibilities. Hopefully you have seen the email, the link to the survey. If you've already taken it, please forgive the reminder, but what we're hoping to do is use the survey to develop profiles, both of all of the individuals participating as well as all of the organizations, and help to set up some initial conversations where we think there might be a match, as well as leave time in Friday's gathering for you to seek out your own organizations based on the menu of options that we provide to you. So filling out the survey will be a big help with that, and will help us with the matching. So we're close to the end of our hour, but if you have any further questions or comments, any feedback, I'd be very happy to hear it.
I think I'm okay right now. I have to just kind of think a little bit more into it, and I'm sure I'll come up with more questions.
We'll be able to take time also on Friday, and I'm available by email or so feel free to reach out. There's another webinar tomorrow, which is going to be more about making the most of your board experience, and both of these recordings will be available. This slide deck will be sent out to you afterwards, so I heard a lot of paper rustling. I hope you didn't go to take a lot of notes, but the actual slide deck will be available to you. So hopefully that will be something that you can reference back to as well.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It was good to meet both of you by phone, and I look forward to meeting you in person next week.
Yes.
You too.
Care.
Thank you.
All right. You take care now.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.